One evening when the whole village was silent and everyone hid behind their closed doors, a terrifying secret was about to surface. Miss Marple had only one option: either reveal the truth to everyone or find those behind the fear. Everyone was hiding something, but one mistake had turned them all into liars. A secret no one could control. Today the village which everyone called home was hiding more than just memories, and Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, was ready to piece together every move. This story didn't start today. It began with a murder that was just a trap. Will you face the truth behind the mystery? The first golden whispers of dawn stretched cautiously across the sky, brushing the sleepy rooftops of Windermere with the gentlest hue of light. Yet beneath that peaceful glow, something unsettling pulsed just beneath the surface. The village, cloaked in the stillness of early morning, seemed almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Dew clung to cobblestones and hedgerows, and a fragile mist lingered low to the ground, as though trying to veil the truth, softening the edges of the familiar with an eerie hush. Eliza Whitmore stepped out of her ivy-covered cottage, with the same calm demeanor that had defined her for years, a woven basket cradled on her arm, and a shawl tucked tight around her shoulders. But her sharp eyes, always quietly calculating, were more alert than usual. As her feet moved along the gravel lane, her senses stirred with each detail others might overlook: a silver hairclip glinting where it shouldn't be, a trail of hurried footprints half washed by the mist, and the unmistakable scent of burnt sugar wafting oddly from behind the baker's shop, far stronger than any ordinary batch. Everyone she passed smiled, but their eyes flickered, nervous, distracted. Mrs. Dalloway, the village's self-appointed gossip, barely nodded from her porch and stared too long at nothing. Mr. Aldridge, the milkman, greeted her with his usual tip of the cap, but beneath his cart lay a crumpled wet tarp with a stain too dark to be just from rain. Even the birds seemed quieter, their chirps broken by long silences. By the time Eliza reached the village green, she could already sense the tension, coiled tightly behind the hedgerows and lace-curtained windows. Whispers followed her like shadows. Inside the tea-room, the warm clinking of porcelain couldn't hide the chill beneath the surface. Two women at the next table leaned in close, their voices thin and trembling. "They say the hangar was locked," one murmured. "From the inside. No one could have left." The other gasped softly, glancing toward the door. "Then how?" Eliza stirred her tea slowly, her expression serene, but her thoughts already racing through possibilities, like pages flipping open in a windstorm. Something had ruptured the calm of Windermere, something deliberate. And when she finally made her way toward the field just past the chapel, she saw it for herself: the wreckage. The biplane, now a mangled carcass of splintered wood and twisted steel, lay sprawled beneath the pale sun like a fallen creature, wings crooked and useless. The air hung heavy with the scent of fuel and scorched earth. Inspector Callum arrived moments later, his polished boots sinking into the sodden earth, as he surveyed the scene with a furrowed brow. But even from a distance, Eliza knew he didn't yet see what she saw. The angle of the propeller, the position of the tail, the odd lack of disturbance around the cockpit. It all spoke volumes, though not aloud. This wasn't just an accident. It wasn't simply a pilot's miscalculation. This had been arranged, hidden under layers of normalcy. Windermere had always been a place of perfect hedges, polite hellos, and tea served promptly at 4. But Eliza had lived long enough to know that quiet villages often bred the darkest secrets. And now, that darkness had returned. It was curling through the cobblestones, whispering through the shutters, hiding in the scent of fresh bread and the rustle of wisteria. Something was unraveling, and the village didn't know it yet, but she did. Eliza didn't just walk through Windermere anymore. She moved through a puzzle, every face a question, every silence a clue. And somewhere beneath the morning calm, someone was already watching her back. The wreckage lay like a broken beast across the mist-drenched field, twisted metal glinting dully beneath the pale light of an overcast sky. While Inspector Alistair Munro stood at its edge, his mouth drawn into a tight, unsmiling line, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his dark fedora. The villagers had gathered in a hushed semicircle, wrapped in heavy coats and fraying scarves, their breath forming pale ghosts in the morning chill, their voices little more than uncertain murmurs that dissolved into the damp air. In a place as small and predictably quiet as Greystone Hollow, where gossip flowed more freely than the stream that split the valley, an incident like this was not just rare, it was seismic. Alistair raised one gloved hand, signaling for the constable to keep the onlookers back, and then knelt beside the remains, running his fingers along the jagged splintered edges of what had once been a wing. The acrid scent of scorched oil clung to the earth, blending with the sour muddy musk of the field, and overhead the sky hung low and grey, as though weighed down by secrets. A gaunt mechanic named Vernon stood nearby, wringing a battered cap between trembling fingers. Pilot's name was Felix Granger, Vernon said without prompting, eyes darting to the wreckage. New to the area, flashy type. Liked to show off. Been flying stunts near the cliffs these past weeks. Alistair didn't respond immediately, but his gaze swept to the crumpled fuselage with a slow intensity. And yet he ends up here, of all places, he said at last, more to himself than anyone else. I wasn't here last night, Vernon added nervously, but the hangar's been locked since sundown. No one could have gotten in, or out. Alistair rose, eyes drawn toward the looming hangar nearby. Its steel doors shut tight. Its lock, a double-bar system, complex enough to guard a fortress. From where he stood, there were no obvious signs of disturbance, no footprints in the soft earth, no broken grass blades, nothing but the quiet hum of dread. He gestured curtly. Bring me the keys. When the constable returned, jangling metal in hand, Alistair didn't rush. Instead, he paced the perimeter of the hangar with deliberate care, noting every detail, the untouched soil near the entrance, the faint scrape along the bottom corner of the door, and a single dead moth pressed against the bolt like a tiny sentinel. As he was about to test the lock, a voice called softly behind him. Inspector Munro. He turned to find Evelyn Hartwell standing just beyond the constable, her slender figure wrapped in a neatly belted coat, a deep green scarf tucked neatly beneath her chin. She looked as though she'd wandered into the scene by accident, but her eyes sharp, knowing betrayed an intent far more purposeful. Didn't expect to see you this early, Miss Hartwell, he said. I was on my morning walk, she replied smoothly, her voice as even and composed as ever. A tragic scene, isn't it? He watched her eyes flicker toward the hangar with pointed curiosity. Locked up tight, she murmured. How odd. Alistair nodded once, then signaled the constable. With a groan of iron and rust, the door creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior cloaked in gloom, and the scent of oil, metal, and something faintly sweet, like burnt syrup. Everything inside was absurdly orderly, as if prepped for an inspection rather than a tragedy. Tools aligned with precision, a workbench unsullied, shelves stacked with untouched parts. Alistair scanned the space in silence, his instincts prickling as he approached the far wall. Evelyn followed at a measured pace, her steps echoing softly on the concrete. There, she said, almost too softly to hear, pointing toward a patch of dirt near the baseboard. He crouched and brushed the earth aside, revealing a small brass key, still clean, as though it had only recently been dropped. Not from the outer lock, he muttered. No, Evelyn agreed, but certainly not lost long ago. He studied her, searching for that flicker that always came before one of her uninvited but invariably accurate theories. But she only smiled, cool and unreadable. You have a theory already, don't you? He asked. Oh, Inspector, she replied, with faint amusement. I'm just an observant passerby. Alistair pocketed the key, exhaling slowly. It's always the observers who complicate things. Or simplify them, she countered. And that slight, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her mouth again. The silence inside the hangar deepened, punctuated only by the faint rustle of dust motes spiraling in beams of light that spilled through high, grime-flecked windows. Outside the wreckage remained, broken, silent, and watching in its own way. and Evelyn stood for a long moment near the threshold, eyes flicking across the hanger, her hands folded like a prayer. Whatever had happened here wasn't just an accident, and whatever came next would depend entirely on who uncovered the truth first. No one paid much attention to Edith Gray, not in the way that mattered. At least, she was the quiet woman in worn tweed and faded brooches, known more for her solitary walks and affinity for herbal teas than for any great insight or strength of mind. But beneath her reserved exterior lived a razor-sharp intellect that missed nothing and forgot even less. So when the news of the crash broke, the experimental aircraft shattered in a blaze at the edge of the abandoned aerodrome, Edith was already there before the crowd, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene with a practiced calm. The air still carried the sour tang of scorched oil, metal, and something more acrid, an afterscent of sabotage. Around her, the wreckage fanned out in an unnaturally symmetrical sprawl, too clean for chaos, too deliberate for chance. Moving with quiet determination, she knelt beside a battered flight jacket, its edges charred but the lining oddly intact. Her gloved fingers traced a seam, and with the faintest tug, a hidden compartment gave way, revealing a key no larger than a thimble, tarnished, delicate, and wholly out of place. Without a word, she slipped it into her handbag. She turned toward the cockpit next, its glass shattered, dials smashed. But again, it was the disorder that felt staged, the kind of mess made by someone trying too hard to fake panic. From a crease behind the control panel, she pulled free a folded scrap of parchment, brittle and aged, with only one letter written in a jagged, ink-smudged hand, a message, a warning, or perhaps a mark left behind by the architect of the destruction. Edith sat on a rusting toolbox nearby, pulling out her leather-bound notebook. She sketched a layout of the hangar, the scorch marks that stopped abruptly near the fuel drums, the strangely untouched toolbox, the single bootprint leading away from the crash, not toward help. None of it made sense if this were truly an accident. Her mind spun connections. The pilot Vincent Carrel, known for his reckless charm and his mounting list of debts. The mechanic, gone without notice 2 days prior. The telegram Edith had intercepted by chance in the post office queue, misdelivered but memorized. The townspeople would talk, of course. They always did. But between the gossip and half-truths, Edith knew the truth hid like a needle buried in soft hay. Rivalries, betrayals, a whispered affair with the mayor's wife, and rumors of a wartime past never fully accounted for. These were not scattered clues, but tightly wound threads in a tapestry of misdirection. As the sun rose higher and cast skeletal shadows across the twisted metal, Edith closed her notebook, her breath slow, steady. The villagers gathering beyond the fence would see only a tragic accident, but Edith saw a story waiting to be exhumed. Layer by layer, mask by mask, she rose with quiet purpose, her handbag tucked close, and her notes secure. Whatever secrets had been burned here, had left ashes behind, and in those ashes, something still smoldered. The room was a curious mix of the ordinary and the slightly unsettling, with its faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, the high, narrow windows filtering in enough light to cast eerie patterns on the floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, caught in the sun's awkward embrace. To most in St. Mary's, this hall was the village's pulse, a place where news traveled faster than the wind, where cakes were critiqued, and where the gossip overflowed like an unchecked river. But today, the usual hum of idle chatter was replaced by a palpable tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The chairs sat in perfect alignment, all facing the long, worn oak table, where Miss Marple had already taken her place. A notebook lay open before her, a pencil poised neatly at its center, untouched but ready. Her glasses gleamed in the dim light as she adjusted them, her fingers steady, her mind already turning over the tangled threads of the mystery she was about to unravel. The first to arrive was Mr. Winthrop, the groundskeeper, his cap in hand, looking every bit like a child, caught in the act of something he couldn't explain. His boots scuffed softly against the floor, and the faint odor of damp earth and wood clung to his brown overcoat. He nodded awkwardly at Miss Marple, the movement hesitant, like someone who had just received an invitation to a party he was certain he wasn't meant to attend. "Good morning, Mr. Winthrop," she said, her voice calm, but cutting through the heavy air, like a knife slicing through butter. "I trust this won't take too much of your time. I only have a few questions." He settled into the chair across from her, shifting uneasily. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, but polite, as though he was trying to hide something. Miss Marple's questions were soft and unhurried at first, about his duties, the routines of the airfield, but as she watched his hands twitch, rough and calloused, she began to notice the subtle shift in his body language, the way his eyes darted toward the window, every time she asked a direct question. When she asked about the hangar's security, his response was immediate. "Always kept locked, that hangar," he said. "You'd need the 2 keys to get in. No getting in or out without them." "And where are those keys kept?" she asked, her voice light, but there was an undercurrent in her tone that suggested she knew the answer already. "Well, I've got one," he said. "The other's with the manager, Mr. Elmsworth." A beat passed. Was there ever an occasion when the hangar was left open? His hesitation lingered longer this time. "Not that I recall, but you know there's a lot of coming and going. Pilots checking their planes. Mechanics working late. I suppose it could have happened. Just never saw it myself." Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft but calculating. She thanked him for his time, but as he stood to leave, she caught sight of a faint limp in his step, something he had conveniently neglected to mention. She filed the detail away for later. The next conversation was with Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, who, unlike Mr. Winthrop, didn't come to the parish hall. Instead, Miss Marple found herself in a drawing room of faded opulence, sunlight filtering through heavy curtains and falling across an intricate carpet of aristocratic design. Lady Ashcombe, the epitome of poised wealth, sat in a high-backed chair, her silver hair arranged with military precision, and her dress as severe as her gaze. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, her voice smooth but distant, "I trust you'll keep this brief. My time is valuable." "Of course, Lady Ashcombe," Miss Marple replied, her tone pleasant but unwavering. She proceeded with her questions about Archibald Sterling, the crash, and their connections to him. At the mention of Sterling's name, Lady Ashcombe's lips tightened ever so slightly, though she masked it with a practiced indifference. She answered in carefully measured tones. "He was a frequent guest at our social events," she said. "Charming, if somewhat theatrical, always eager to draw attention to himself." Miss Marple probed further, asking if Sterling had ever discussed his work or the stunts at the airfield. Lady Ashcombe's eyes flickered for a moment before she answered. "Occasionally, though it wasn't of much interest to me. He did mention some issues with a rival, but I didn't press him. It all seemed rather melodramatic." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "And did you notice anything unusual in his behavior recently? Anything that might have indicated he was troubled?" Lady Ashcombe paused, her eyes drifting toward the window, as if seeking a moment to compose herself. "No more than usual, I suppose. He was always a man of extremes. It's possible he had enemies. Men like him often do. But I can't say for certain." As Miss Marple prepared to leave, her sharp eyes caught sight of something on the side table. A folded letter, its crest unfamiliar, the faint initials AS barely visible. She filed that detail away, her mind already calculating its significance. The final interview was at the village library, with Mr. Clarence Blythe. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of a page turning in the distance. Mr. Blythe, well-dressed but unassuming, sat opposite her, his eyes weary but sharp, his speech measured. "Archibald and I were friends," he said, his voice soft but certain. "We flew together a few times. He was brash, confident, to the point of recklessness." Miss Marple's questions grew more pointed. "Did you ever have cause to doubt his judgment?" Blythe hesitated for a moment, Then his eyes flickered toward the window, as if seeking refuge in the outside world before answering. I did. There was something in the air today that felt different, an unsettling heaviness that clung to the walls of the parish hall. The once pristine paint on the walls now peeled like old skin, revealing the bare bones of the building, while the narrow windows let in a thin slice of light that seemed to dance on the dust motes floating lazily in the stillness. This room, which had long been the heartbeat of the village, where secrets and stories were exchanged with the same casual ease as the cakes that were judged here, now had an air of quiet foreboding. The chairs were arranged with military precision, all facing a worn oak table, where Miss Marple sat, her eyes sharp and calculating, her notebook open, the pencil poised in the center like a weapon, waiting for its moment. As the first person arrived, Mr. Winthrop, the groundskeeper. He looked like someone who had just been caught in a lie. His cap was in hand, his boots dragging slightly, as he made his way to the chair opposite her, the faint scent of damp earth following him. "Good morning, Mr. Winthrop," she greeted him, her voice light, but carrying an edge that suggested no one could lie to her. "Not for long." He nodded, but his movements were stiff, his hands twisting in his lap as he settled into the chair. As she began her questioning, his answers were straightforward, almost too easy, like he was trying too hard to make things seem simple. But it was in the small details, the way his gaze flickered to the window whenever she mentioned the hangar, the way his hands twitched when she asked about security, that Miss Marple noticed the cracks in his calm facade. When she inquired about the security of the hangar, he became almost defensive. "It's always locked," he said, his voice thick with a sincerity that felt rehearsed. "You'd need 2 keys to get in. No one can get in or out without them." When she asked about the whereabouts of the keys, he hesitated, offering her the same answer as before. "Well, I have one. The other's with Mr. Elmsworth." It was a small thing, but the hesitation in his voice raised a red flag. As she pressed him further about whether the hangar had ever been left open, he became even more evasive. "Not that I recall," he said quickly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "But you know there's always a lot of coming and going. Pilots, mechanics, that sort of thing. It could have happened, but I never saw it myself." Satisfied but not convinced, Miss Marple thanked him, but as he rose to leave, she noticed a subtle limp in his step, one he had clearly tried to hide. That detail, she knew, would be important later. The next meeting was with Lady Elena Ashcombe, who had declined to meet at the parish hall, instead inviting Miss Marple to her grand but faded estate. The opulence of her surroundings was undeniable, but it was a wealth that had seen better days. The walls adorned with portraits whose colors had dulled with age, the curtains drawn tight against the light. Lady Ashcombe herself was the picture of poised aristocracy, sitting upright in a chair that seemed to mirror her stern no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss Marple," she greeted, her voice cool but cordial, as though she had already sized up the woman before her, and found her wanting. "I trust this will be brief. My time is valuable." Miss Marple's response was immediate, but polite. "Of course, Lady Ashcombe," she said, keeping her tone respectful but firm. The conversation shifted quickly to Archibald Sterling, and at the mention of his name, Lady Ashcombe's composure slipped for the briefest of moments. Her lips twitched just enough to reveal a flicker of emotion before she masked it again. Her answers were careful, rehearsed. "He was a frequent guest at our events," she said, her words measured. "A charming man, if a bit theatrical, always eager to be the center of attention." Miss Marple's questions grew sharper. "Did he ever discuss his work with you? The stunts? The airfield?" Lady Ashcombe's eyes narrowed slightly as she answered. "Occasionally, though it was never of much interest to me. He mentioned some rivalry with a man, but I didn't press him. It all seemed melodramatic." As Miss Marple pressed on, asking if anything unusual had seemed to trouble Sterling recently, Lady Ashcombe hesitated. "He was always a man of extremes," she said, her gaze briefly flicking toward the window. "If he had enemies, I'm sure it was because of his own doing." Miss Marple noted her every word, but it was the small details she caught out of the corner of her eye. a folded letter on the side table with the crest of an unfamiliar organization, and the faint initials "AS" that captured her attention. After the brief interview with Lady Ashcombe, Miss Marple moved on to meet with Mr. Clarence Blythe, a man whose composure was less polished, but no less important to the unfolding mystery. He was a man of few words, and as he spoke about his friendship with Sterling, there was a heaviness to his tone that spoke volumes. "We flew together a few times," he said, his mustache twitching as he spoke. He was reckless, confident, but in a way that made me question his judgment at times. Miss Marple's questions grew more pointed. "Did you ever doubt his judgment?" Blythe's hesitation was telling. "I did. It wasn't just the flying. There were small things too. Missed steps during pre-flight checks. Showing up late without explanation. Nothing major, but it wasn't like him." As Miss Marple continued, she caught sight of a slight twitch in Blythe's jaw, a subtle clue that something was gnawing at him. The conversation ended shortly after, but Miss Marple had already filed the detail away. Finally, she met with Inspector Harold at the police station. His attitude was defensive from the start, and as Miss Marple probed into the timing of the airfield's lockdown, she sensed a crack in his veneer. "I was called right after the crash," he said. But Miss Marple's probing question about the hangar's security raised his hackles. "The hangar was sealed as soon as we got there," he explained. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. "Who had access to the keys before then?" she asked innocently, watching the shift in his expression. "The usual personnel," he replied, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't see how this is relevant." As Miss Marple left the station, her mind was already turning over the fragments of the puzzle, the unanswered questions swirling like fog in her mind. That night, as she sat by her fireplace, the pieces began to fall into place. The inconsistencies, the nervousness of Winthrop, Lady Ashcombe's evasions, Blythe's hesitation, and Harold's guarded responses, all pointed to something more than a mere accident. There was a plan at play here, one so carefully crafted that even the smallest mistake could bring it all tumbling down. She could feel the threads beginning to pull tighter, but the final revelations would take more than just careful observation. It would require a leap into the unknown. The hangar was dark now, the shadows deepening and distorting the wreckage into sharp, jagged shapes. Miss Marple entered, her footsteps echoing softly in the silence, every inch of her alert to the smallest detail. The workbench was neat, but upon closer inspection, she noticed faint smudges on the tools. Someone had been there recently, gripping them without actually using them. She moved on, her steps deliberate as she approached the hangar's main door. The lock gleamed in the last light of day, and as she bent closer, a subtle mark caught her eye, a thin line where the metal had been disturbed. It was small, almost invisible, but it was enough. Someone had tampered with the lock. The evidence was undeniable, and it confirmed her suspicions. This was no accident. The hangar had been sealed for a reason, and whoever was behind it had known exactly how to cover their tracks. The truth was close now. The night had deepened over St. Mary's, casting long, creeping shadows over the quiet streets. Miss Merrill moved with quiet purpose, her eyes scanning the darkened village as she made her way toward the heart of it. The square was nearly deserted now, save for a few lingering figures closing their stalls. Yet, amid the dying glow of lanterns and the fading hum of conversations, she could sense the subtle undercurrent of unease, a tension that clung to the air. Something was amiss, and she had the unsettling feeling that she was getting closer to unraveling it. Her boots crunched lightly over the cobblestones as she moved through the emptying market. The soft chatter of townsfolk had been replaced by the stillness of the night, but their murmurs hadn't escaped her. Casual exchanges about the weather, the recent tragedy, and the steady ebb of daily life, they all held undertones, cracks beneath the surface. Miss Merrill knew well that people spoke in fragments when they were comfortable, when they thought no one was listening. A conversation by the old churchyard caught her attention, their words slipping out unintentionally, like forgotten whispers of something darker. "Never resolved, you know, all these years." She caught the tail end of a sentence as she passed, but she didn't stop to pry. The words haunted her though. Never resolved. What had happened all those years ago? What could be lingering, festering beneath the peaceful veneer of the village? As she moved on, the next few faces she passed seemed to offer clues in their own way. Mr. Elmsworth's hesitation when she mentioned the old airfield manager was subtle, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. There was more to the crash than just the wreckage. And the locked hangar. There was a history here, one that had been carefully buried, never fully resolved. The air was thick with it. Returning to the quiet of her sitting room, the faint murmur of the village fading into the background, Miss Merrill sat before her notes. Everything was starting to fit together in a way that made her heart race. It wasn't just about the crash anymore. It was about something deeper, something older that the crash had stirred up again. The locked hangar wasn't just an alibi. It was a carefully orchestrated message, a facade to cover up something that had been set in motion long before the accident. Her pen moved quickly across the page, detailing the names and events she had uncovered so far. A slip of the tongue here, a subtle hesitation there. As her thoughts clicked into place like the tumblers of a lock, she understood. Someone was hiding something. It wasn't just the plane that had crashed. It was the weight of secrets, buried beneath the surface of this quiet village. Secrets that were starting to leak through, one small clue at a time. Miss Merrill knew she needed to press harder, to listen more carefully, to observe more closely. She could feel it, the storm on the horizon. By the time she made her way to the village hall that night, the tension was unbearable. The familiar wooden building, its panels darkened with age, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The faint flicker of candlelight did little to chase away the shadows, which seemed to stretch and contract as if alive. The suspects trickled in one by one, each of them like a small piece in a puzzle, and she knew this would be the final step. Lady Asham entered first, her presence as cold and precise as ever. Her elegance cut through the room like a blade, her every move measured, controlled. Behind her Mr. Winthrop shuffled in, his slumped shoulders and disheveled appearance stark against Lady Asham's poised perfection. He was a man used to being overlooked, and Miss Merrill had a feeling he knew more than he let on. Finally, Inspector Harold arrived, his face set in a mask of discomfort as he scanned the room. The tension was palpable as he took his seat. Miss Merrill, seated at the head of the table, made no move to acknowledge the discomfort that radiated from him. She simply watched, her gaze steady, piercing through the layers of facades they had all put up. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound filling the space as she addressed them. Her voice calm, but with an edge of quiet determination. "Thank you for coming," she said, her words weighing heavily in the room. The game had begun, and she was ready to pull the final threads together, unraveling the truth piece by piece, until the entire web of lies and secrets was exposed for all to see. Miss Merrill's voice sliced through the tense stillness in the room, soft yet firm, each word deliberate. "I understand that this gathering might feel somewhat unusual, but given the recent events, we find ourselves grappling with more questions than answers. Perhaps if we speak plainly, we can shed some light on what we know, and what we've observed." Her words hung in the air, unchallenged, as the room settled into a thick silence. Lady Asham sat poised, her posture immaculate, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her serene expression gave nothing away, but the eyes beneath her calm facade darted carefully across the table, taking in every detail. Across from her Mr. Winthrop, the caretaker of the airfield, sat rigidly. His outward calm was punctuated by the almost imperceptible tapping of his fingers on the table's edge, betraying a hint of internal agitation. Inspector Harold, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, shifted his weight slightly, his gaze fixed on Miss Merrill. Every move he made seemed to carry the weight of years of experience in unspoken tension. "Let's begin with the airfield," Miss Merrill continued, her tone as smooth as it was authoritative. "We know the hangar was locked. We know that Mr. Sterling was the only one inside. At least that's what the records and the testimony suggest. But if that were truly the case, someone must have tampered with that lock." She glanced at Mr. Winthrop first, her gaze unwavering. "You maintained the airfield grounds, did you not? You had one of the keys." Mr. Winthrop straightened slightly, his hands clasped in front of him, as though to steady himself. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quickly, his voice betraying no trace of doubt. "I kept the place tidy, looked after the hangar. I had one key, and the other was with Mr. Elmsworth, the manager, though he's no longer with us." "Correct," Miss Marple acknowledged, nodding thoughtfully, her sharp eyes never leaving his face. "But was the hangar always locked in the evenings, as a matter of routine, Mr. Winthrop's brow furrowed for a brief moment, and then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It was standard procedure." "And yet," Miss Marple's voice dropped a fraction, her words hanging heavy in the air, "not everyone followed that practice strictly, did they?" A murmur rippled through the room as Mr. Winthrop's grip on his hat tightened. His silence spoke louder than any words, a subtle admission of something unsaid. The room was growing heavier by the second, and Miss Marple shifted her attention, moving seamlessly from one face to the next. "Lady Asham," she began, her voice cool and even. "You've hosted several social gatherings where Mr. Sterling was a guest. Did he ever express any concerns about the hangar or the airfield?" Lady Asham's gaze never faltered, as she lifted a single brow, the most minimal of gestures. "Concerns?" she echoed, her voice soft but calculated. "Not that I can recall. Mr. Sterling was too focused on his flight schedules, too preoccupied with his upcoming endeavors. I doubt he troubled himself with such mundane matters." "Of course," Miss Marple said, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corners of her lips, though it was quickly masked by her next question. "But did he seem preoccupied with anything else? Anything unusual, perhaps?" A slight smile graced Lady Asham's lips, almost imperceptible, as though she were savoring a private joke. "Mr. Sterling had many concerns. How to earn more money, how to spend it. Such is the life of a man in his profession. I hardly think that's unusual." Miss Marple absorbed this with a slow nod, considering the layers beneath the polite surface. She turned to the next person in the room, her attention never wavering. "And you, Mr. Blay?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly, as she focused on the former co-pilot. "You flew with Mr. Sterling for several years, didn't you?" "Yes," Mr. Blay replied, his voice steady, but his body language betraying a hint of unease. "We flew together on numerous stunts. He was a risk-taker, but he knew his limits. Or at least I thought he did." Miss Marple tilted her head, her piercing gaze locked on his face. "Did he ever mention feeling threatened by anyone? Perhaps a rival, or an unsettled debt?" Mr. Blay hesitated, his fingers twitching nervously, as though weighing his next words. "No," he said slowly, shaking his head. "He never said anything like that. But," he paused, his eyes darting to the side, before returning to meet Miss Marple's steady gaze. "He had a way of getting under people's skin. Not everyone appreciated his flair for the dramatic." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft but calculating. "And how would you describe his demeanor in the weeks leading up to the crash?" Mr. Blay shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of her scrutiny. "Restless. He seemed distracted, preoccupied. But he always managed to pull himself together before a flight. But this time," Miss Marple's voice dropped to a near whisper, "something was different, wasn't it?" Mr. Blay's eyes flickered down to his hands, as if searching for something to steady him. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "something was different this time." Miss Marple turned her gaze now to Inspector Harold, her sharp eyes locking with his. "Inspector, you arrived at the airfield shortly after the crash, did you not?" "Yes," Harold responded, his voice firm, his posture rigid. "That's correct. And when you arrived," Miss Marple continued, "the hangar was still locked." "Yes," Harold confirmed, his voice unwavering. "We had to open it ourselves." "Interesting," Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving his. "The lock showed no signs of being forced. Someone must have opened it before then, and locked it again afterward. Would you agree, Inspector?" Harold's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, he seemed to grapple with the implications of her question. "It's possible," he said, his tone measured, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with a sharpness that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "And the key I found in Mr. Sterling's jacket," she said smoothly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's not from the main lock, is it?" Harold hesitated before shaking his head. "No," he admitted. "It's a spare key, for a smaller storage compartment inside the hangar." Miss Merrill absorbed this piece of the puzzle with a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "That narrows the possibilities." Her gaze swept around the room, locking eyes with each person in turn. "What we have now," she continued, her voice steady and commanding, "is a locked hangar, a cryptic note, and several conflicting statements. If we are to understand what truly happened that night, we must not only consider what was said, but also what was left unsaid." The room seemed to hold its breath as her words hung in the air. Miss Merrill knew the truth was close, almost within reach. But the puzzle pieces had to fall into place, and only if they were willing to face the unsettling truth that loomed just beyond their grasp. The room was thick with the weight of unspoken words. Not a single person dared to break the silence, as the tension hung heavy in the air. The suspects, sitting in a loose semicircle, exchanged wary glances, their unease palpable. It was clear to everyone present that the truth, no longer theirs to protect, was beginning to slip away. Miss Marple, poised and calm, remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable, as she observed the scene unfolding. Mr. Bligh, who had thus far been the most composed of the group, shifted slightly, leaning forward, the muscles in his jaw tightening. His voice, which had started off measured, now carried an unmistakable edge. "I've told you everything you need to know," he said, his tone flat but tinged with annoyance. "I was at the inn until 7. After that, I went straight home." He folded his arms tightly, as if to assert control over the situation, his eyes now hard and unwavering. But across the table, Mr. Winthrop, his posture jittery, couldn't hold back any longer. "That's not right," he said, the words coming out with an almost accusatory edge. "I saw you at the airfield around 6:30. Bligh's response was instant, sharp. "You're mistaken." The room fell silent for a beat, as Winthrop, undeterred, pressed on. "Am I?" His gaze flicked nervously to Miss Marple, as though looking for a silent ally. "I know what I saw." His words hung in the air, challenging Bligh's version of events. It was then that Inspector Harold, his patience wearing thin, interjected with a clipped tone. "Let's keep this civil, gentlemen," he said, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet authority. Bligh leaned back in his chair, but his eyes never left Winthrop, his expression hardening further. The tension shifted in the room, becoming more personal, more raw. Lady Ashcombe, who had been silently observing until now, shifted in her seat, her gloved fingers adjusting the cuff of her sleeve with deliberate precision. Clearing her throat, she smoothly drew everyone's attention. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "surely we can keep these discussions civil. There's no need to turn this into a shouting match." Miss Marple, her gaze sharp and thoughtful, tilted her head slightly, studying Lady Ashcombe with a keen interest. There was no change in the woman's outward composure, but Miss Marple noticed the faintest furrow on her brow, a subtle shift that hinted at something more. The moment was brief, but it was enough to catch Miss Marple's attention. "Lady Ashcombe," she began, her voice polite but pointed, "forgive me for prying, but you haven't yet mentioned where you were the evening of the crash." The question was simple, but it held weight, and Miss Ashcombe's face flickered with the briefest hint of something. Was it discomfort? Before she masked it with a tight smile. "I was hosting a dinner party," she replied smoothly. "I believe I mentioned it earlier." Miss Marple nodded, but her tone remained unwavering. "Indeed you did. But the timing seems unclear. Did you remain at the house all evening?" The question hung in the air, almost daring Lady Ashcombe to contradict herself. Lady Ashcombe's fingers stilled on her gloves, her composure faltering for the briefest moment. "I believe so," she answered after a moment, her voice tight. "I may have stepped out into the garden for a breath of air, but the guests were all present for the entire meal. They can confirm that." Miss Marple said nothing, only nodding once, a quiet acknowledgement that held more weight than it seemed. The silence that followed was anything but comfortable. Lady Ashcombe adjusted her glove again, a small gesture that betrayed a flicker of tension. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her tone almost soothing. "Thank you, Lady Ashcombe. That's very helpful." Inspector Harold cleared his throat, stepping forward to address the group. "It seems we have some conflicting accounts here," he said, his tone brisk, his eyes scanning the room. "But speculation won't get us anywhere. Let's stick to the facts." His gaze flicked to Miss Marple, his expression firm. "Is there anything else you need to ask?" Miss Marple stood, smoothing her cardigan with a deliberate calmness. "Not at the moment, Inspector," she replied, her voice measured. "I believe we've uncovered quite enough for now." Her words were polite, yet there was an underlying sharpness to them that made the room feel even colder. "Thank you all for your time," she added, her gaze lingering on each suspect. "I'm sure the truth will come to light soon enough." The suspects filed out one by one, their unease trailing behind them like a shadow, leaving the room in a tense stillness. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands clasped together as she stared after them, her mind already piecing together the fragments of their stories. She wasn't merely watching them leave, she was already assembling the puzzle in her mind, noting each crack in their carefully crafted facades. Later, in the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her worn notebook open before her, a pencil tapping rhythmically against the paper. Outside, the village seemed to stir slowly, the faint clatter of a cartwheel, the distant call of a child to a dog, the muffled exchanges between neighbors, all of it barely registered in her mind. Her focus remained entirely on the notebook in front of her, where each detail, each observation, each contradiction was meticulously recorded. The key found in Sterling's jacket, the peculiar dual lock system of the hanger, the note with the cryptic letter E, that now stood out like a signature on a confession. Everything was beginning to fit together. She tapped the pencil thoughtfully against the paper, her mind unraveling the complex web of motives and means. The suspects' alibis, their inconsistencies, the small cracks in their stories, all of it was leading her closer to the truth. A truth that, she was certain, would soon reveal itself. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, each moment stretching longer than the last, as the weight of Miss Marple's observations hung in the air. There was enough doubt to make the situation murky, but not enough clarity to remove suspicion completely, especially with Inspector Harold's tight-lipped responses gnawing at her thoughts. The deliberate omissions in his answers spoke volumes. Every word, every glance, seemed carefully curated to keep certain truths hidden. Her mind worked over them like a puzzle piece that just wouldn't quite fit until finally, she closed her notebook, a quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. She had everything she needed now. The fragments of a mystery too intricate to ignore were all neatly assembled before her. What remained was the final act, bringing the truth into the light, where everyone involved could see it for themselves. With deliberate movements, Miss Marple stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt as she prepared to leave. The night at the village hall would be the moment it all came together, the night the pieces would fall into place, one by one. The hall was charged with an eerie stillness as the suspects took their places around the table, each one twitching in their seats, the tension barely contained behind tight lips and uneasy glances. Miss Marple entered quietly, her presence as unassuming as always, but the effect was immediate. The room fell into a hush, all eyes on her as she settled herself at the head of the table, her posture relaxed but poised, radiating the calm of someone who had already seen the end of the story. As the last murmur of conversation faded, she began, not with a rush of accusations, but with the steady, methodical tone of someone sharing a lesson, one that was about to teach them all the price of deceit. "As you all know," she began, her voice soft but clear, "we've been trying to piece together the events surrounding Mr. Sterling's crash. On the surface it seemed like a simple accident, a locked hangar, a tragic mistake. But that locked door was the first crack in the facade. A clue that something more was at play." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, before continuing with slow precision. She explained the complexities of the dual lock system on the hangar, how it wasn't just a key that could open the door, but a mechanism requiring specific knowledge, a knowledge that only a few people, perhaps only one, could possess. As she spoke, her gaze swept across the room, each glance a subtle inspection of their reactions. Lady Ashcombe sat unmoving, her expression poised, but the faintest flicker of discomfort passed over her face. Winthrop, on the other hand, shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Miss Marple and the others, while Mr. Bligh remained unnervingly still, his face a mask of indifference. "The key," Miss Marple continued, "was found in Mr. Sterling's jacket, but it wasn't for the main lock. That key was planted there, placed with deliberate care to mislead us. And then there was the note, the single letter a subtle clue, but one that, when examined carefully, made the entire incident no longer seem like an accident, but something far more calculated." She let the weight of her words hang in the air, her voice softening as the tension in the room thickened. She then turned her attention to Lady Ashcombe, her gaze unwavering. "Lady Ashcombe," she said, her tone deceptively gentle, "you were at the center of this." She laid it out clearly, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place one by one. The locked door, the key, the carefully crafted alibi. These were all part of a plan to shift suspicion away from you. But it was you who orchestrated everything. Every detail, every move was designed to mislead. A murmur ran through the room, the subtle sound of shock and disbelief as Lady Ashcombe's calm, collected mask began to crack. Her lips pressed together, her face paling slightly, but she remained silent, her composure starting to unravel in real time. Miss Marple's gaze didn't falter. "The locked hangar was not merely a physical barrier," she explained, her voice low and deliberate. "It was a message, a signal that something impossible had occurred. Only someone with your resources, someone with intimate knowledge of the airfield, could have orchestrated it. You ensured that the evidence pointed away from you, while leaving just enough confusion to keep everyone guessing." Lady Ashcombe's hand rose instinctively to her throat, a quick motion that betrayed her inattention, the facade slipping further. "Everyone could see it now. But you didn't do it alone," Miss Marple said, her words slicing through the air with sharp finality, her gaze turning to the others, her voice taking on an edge of quiet certainty. The room fell into an expectant silence, the pieces of the puzzle hanging just out of reach, waiting for the final revelation. Her voice shifted slightly, a subtle change that signaled something deeper, something more forceful. Miss Marple's gaze turned cold, unwavering as she directed her attention back to Inspector Harold. "You knew more than you admit," she said, her tone soft but biting. "You withheld certain key details, allowing certain assumptions to grow and fester while Lady Ashcombe meticulously orchestrated her plan. You ensured the investigation wouldn't uncover the truth." Inspector Harold's face reddened, his posture stiffened in a flash of indignation. "That's preposterous," he snapped, his voice sharp. "I was only following orders." Miss Marple didn't flinch. She interrupted him with quiet grace, her voice a calm ripple through the growing tension. "You thought it was for the greater good, perhaps to avoid a scandal," she said, almost maternally. "But in doing so, you became part of the scheme." The words hit him with more force than any accusation. Harold's denial faltered, dying before it could reach his lips. The room was silent now, the air thick with expectation. All eyes were on Miss Marple, who seemed utterly unperturbed by the growing weight of the revelation. She allowed the silence to hang before turning back to Lady Ashcombe, her gaze piercing, her voice even quieter but no less impactful. "You tried to make it all seem like an accident," she continued, her words slow and deliberate. "A tragic mishap, a twist of fate. But the details, they are what unraveled your plan. The planted evidence, the inconsistencies in your timeline, the knowledge only someone like you could have had, the pieces, Lady Ashcombe, all pointed directly back to you. For a moment, Lady Ashcombe's face drained of color. She seemed poised to speak, to defend herself. But then something shifted. Her shoulders sagged slightly, her mask of composure cracking just enough for the truth to leak through. "I never meant for it to come to this," she muttered, her voice faint, almost regretful. "I only wanted to protect, to ensure." Her words trailed off, and the room fell silent once more, the weight of her unfinished confession lingering in the air. Miss Marple nodded once, almost in acknowledgement of the fragile admission, her expression unchanged, as if the confession was merely the final formality in a long and tiresome process. She turned to face the rest of the room, her voice calm, cutting through the last vestiges of tension. "And so, we have our answers," she said, the finality in her words as clear as the rising dawn. The locked hanger, the false clues, the selective omissions, they were all part of a carefully crafted plan. But as we've seen, no matter how intricate the design, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. The room exhaled collectively, though no one dared speak. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, folding her hands, her gaze distant, contemplative. The case at long last was closed. Outside, the morning sun began to bathe the village in its golden glow. The village green, which had so recently been under the heavy cloak of uncertainty and tension, seemed to breathe once more, its pulse slowing as the last of the shadows retreated. A freshly mended garden fence stood straight and proud near the bakery, where the faint smell of warm bread drifted through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of cut grass. Children, who had kept their games confined to whispers and stolen moments, now ran freely through the cobbled streets, their laughter ringing out clear and true. The air was alive with the peaceful simplicity of life, finding its way back to normal. Miss Marple, for her part, strolled along her usual route, her steps measured and unhurried as she passed familiar faces. Neighbors greeted her with warm nods and a few kind words, and she returned each smile, though her own was touched with a quiet thoughtfulness, a lingering weight. She paused by the newly planted daisies in the churchyard, nodding approvingly at their arrangement, a small but telling detail that reminded her of the importance of care, of patience, of things growing slowly but steadily. Little things like this made the village feel whole again, restored after the storm of secrets had passed. She continued her walk, her feet carrying her towards the bridge that spanned the narrow creek behind the village hall. The gentle trickle of water, accompanied by the occasional bird call, soothed her as she stood for a moment, watching the water shift and break apart beneath the bridge. It mirrored the fragments of the mystery that had once seemed insurmountable, but now, like the water, the pieces were coming together, clear and defined. Her hands rested lightly on the stone parapet, and she listened to the breeze, carrying the distant sounds of life in the village. Laughter, chatter, the familiar, everyday sounds that now seemed sweeter than before. The truth, like the morning light, had revealed itself, and with it, peace had returned to the village once more. The tension had melted away, as Miss Marple returned to the comforting stillness of her home, the familiar hum of the kettle filling the room. The quiet buzz of the evening seemed to settle into the small sitting room, where the faint warmth of a dying fire lingered in the hearth, casting soft flickering shadows across the walls. With the grace of someone who had long ago made this space her own, Miss Marple moved fluidly, as if every corner of the room, every book, every knick-knack, had become an extension of herself. The walls were lined with the wisdom of the ages, bookshelves brimming with stories, each a testament to the endless contradictions of human nature. In the far corner, a small table sat beside her chair, a neat pile of untouched notes awaiting her attention. Yet for now, they would remain undisturbed. She poured her tea, a faint thoughtful smile, gracing her lips, the kind that seemed to acknowledge the case's closure, but also hinted at a deeper contemplation. Her gaze lingered over the steaming cup, her mind not fully settled on the finality of the investigation. The case, though solved, had unearthed much more than mere facts. It had revealed the raw, tangled motivations of the people she had come to know, their fears, insecurities, desires, and jealousies, forces as ancient and unyielding as time itself. It had been these same driving forces that had transformed the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead into a stage for betrayal, deception, and carefully plotted manipulation. She knew, though, that the motivations that shaped the lives of the villagers were not so very different from those that had shaped the grand tragedies and dramas of history. Miss Marple set her cup down, her eyes drifting to the garden visible through her window, the faint murmur of life just beyond her reach. In the distance, a cat prowled lazily along the stone wall, its tail flicking as it meandered through the fading light of evening. To an outsider, the village would appear unchanged, peaceful even, but Miss Marple knew better. Though the wounds of the past had healed, the memory of what had transpired would not fade so easily. Beneath the tranquil exterior, the echoes of the deception would linger, just out of sight, like a hidden undertow beneath calm waters. People would speak of it in hushed tones for a time, and then, as all things do in a village so close-knit, the tale would eventually fade into the fabric of everyday life. A new story, neatly tucked away behind white picket fences and painted doors. Another chapter in the long history of St. Mary Mead. With a soft sigh, Miss Marple's hand settled on her notebook, her pencil poised over the page. The quiet rhythm of her thoughts found their way into the words she carefully wrote down. Her final reflections on the case, not just the facts, but the pattern she had unraveled. Deception, she mused, was never born of simple malice. It grew from the tangled roots of human frailty, from pride, love, resentment, and fear, motives that, when mixed, formed the perfect storm of dishonesty and intrigue. And untangling those knots, understanding the deeper layers of the heart, required more than sharp intellect. It demanded a sense of empathy, of intuition that went beyond logic. Once she finished writing, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the notebook now closed, its contents a quiet testament to her sharp mind and steady hand. The sunlight had shifted, casting a warm golden glow across the room, filling the space with a peaceful, almost reverent warmth. She picked up her cup once more, savoring the simple pleasure of the moment, the quiet that had returned with the setting sun. The village might have its secrets, she thought, but secrets had a way of coming to light, especially when one had the patience to wait, the wisdom to see through the veils people so carefully constructed. As long as she remained a part of St. Mary Mead, there would be no mystery too elusive, no truth too buried. The final note of her tea lingered, like the closing chapter of a book, and Miss Marple felt, for a brief moment, that all was right in the world once more.